Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Regular listeners of this podcast will know that I read quite eclectically. I get sent so many books from different publishers and authors that it's impossible for me to be anything other than an eclectic reader. So when my next guest author's book landed on my desk a couple of months ago, I was so excited. This is a book with all the feels: unforgettable characters, delightful romance, humour, food to salivate over, and destinations to dream of. An homage to Italy and complete sensory experience from an Aussie author that global best-selling authors like Emily Henry, Marian and Beth O'Leary will happily cover quote for. I am, of course, talking about the wonderfully talented Lizzy Dent and her new novel, Just One Taste, published in Australia recently by HarperCollins. Welcome to the podcast, Lizzy.
Oh, thank you for having me. Exciting.
It's an absolute joy for me to be able to speak to you. And I'm utterly thrilled to have discovered your work and can't wait to have the time to dive into your backlist. Just One Taste is your fourth adult novel, but it's the first to be published in Australia. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, the first two were published through Penguin in the UK and distributed in Australia and New Zealand. And then the second one was published in the States and distributed through Australia and New Zealand. But as I have learned in the last 6 months, there is no substitute for having an Australian publisher on the ground acquire your book. It's been amazing. What a difference.
That is so lovely to hear. Now, Lizzy, you're an expat living in Austria. So, it must be really exciting to see your work find an audience in your home country.
It's been like one of the best things in my career, actually, because I remember when The Summer Job came out, which was the big debut, and it was bought at auction in America and bought in the UK, and everything was really exciting. And I remember thinking, this is all well and good, but I want to be where my family is and my friends are and where I grew up, going into those bookshops and being in those, press articles and with those readers and those bookstagrammers. And so this has been a totally different experience for me, and it's been really great. And obviously, your listeners will probably know by now because we're not quiet about it, but my cousin is amazing, Rachel Johns. And we've been, she's really responsible for giving me the confidence to write at all. And we speak all the time. And when my first 3 books came out in Australia, it was a bit disappointing that we didn't get to do anything together. Obviously she shouts about everything I do and I shout about everything she does. But we thought there'd be more stuff. And so this book was really great to have the opportunity to have a launch in Sydney with my beloved cousin, who's basically like a sister to me, and do it properly Aussie style. It was great.
So wonderful. And as I said to you before we started recording, I was aware of that event and I wish that I could have gone, because I reckon that would have been something truly special to have the two of you sitting there chin wagging about this fantastic book.
It was really good fun. Although my family kind of drunkenly hijacked some of the questions. It's not very nice being asked about the level of spice in your book by someone while your dad is sitting 20 feet away holding a beer and you're like, does he even know what that means?
Well, I'm sure you explained it eloquently for his consumption.
Of course, of course.
So, Lizzy, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about your writing journey, because you've had a varied career, I think it's fair to say. You've worked in hospitality and then making music TV for MTV and creating digital content for various networks. So I guess I wanted to know, when did you first decide that you wanted to become a novelist?
It's such a strange journey. I would consider that my career has been like a career built on a lack of creative confidence. So I worked in very creative industries and I was part of teams that created really creative stuff. And occasionally I wrote and directed and made some stuff myself. But generally, I had a real fear of failure and judgment and loads of self-doubt. So when I entered like the TV advertising world in my early 20s, that was kind of what happened. I did okay, but I never had the, I don't know, the confidence to kind of say, hey, look what I can do. Yeah, confidence was a big problem. And then I remember when Rachel, this is going to involve a lot of Rachel Johns, but I remember when Rachel Johns wrote her first book, and she's my younger cousin. And I remember like just being so in awe. And the biggest awe factor, apart from the fact that she was so bloody good at it, was the confidence factor. I went and met her in Perth. We were having lunch in Swan Valley. This before I'd had any babies, but she'd already had three. She got going very young. But I was sitting at the table with her and I said, how did you have the confidence to actually put things out that people would judge? She sort of was like, I don't know, I just do it. And I just couldn't get my head around it. I was like, yeah, but like, what if people don't like it? What if you put it out and it's badly received and it does terribly and it's a failure? Like, how do you get back from that? And she was like, I don't know, I just love writing. It's all I want to do. It's all I can do. I don't think I could stop it. She's so dedicated to being an author and writing. And I guess a couple of years later, I got made redundant. I'd had my first baby and I got made redundant from my TV career. And my partner said to me, well, you've got some time, you've had a payout. Why don't you figure out what you really want to do next? Because he knew that I'd sort of struggled to find my place. And I said, well, I've always wanted to write a book. And so I did. I took 3 months and I wrote a novel. Giving you my whole life story here. I wrote the book in 3 months while my daughter was in daycare for just a few hours a day. And then I sent it to a guy that I'd met through TV, a guy called Julian Friedman. And I knew he had something to do with the publishing industry, but I didn't know what. And I was so green. I mean, even despite having Rachel, I didn't know the British publishing industry. I didn't know how it worked. I didn't know anything. And I sent him a message on Twitter and I said, hey, Julian, remember me? We met at this TV conference. I said, I've written a book and I want someone to tell me if it's shit or not. What do I do? Question mark. And he wrote back, send it to me. And I remember reading it thinking, oh no, I don't want you to read it. I want to know what to do next. And then this is so dumb. But then I Googled him and realized he owned one of London's leading literary agencies. I was so not involved in publishing and so involved in television. All I knew about him was that he had something to do with publishing and worked in publishing, but I didn't realize he actually owned Blake Friedman and with his ex-partner Carol Blake. And so when he said send it to me, that was like nobody gets that. It's really lucky. So I sent it to him and then he signed me. And then it was just like, so with my career, I wrote 3 YA novels with Julian at Blake Friedman. I was mainly dealing with his youngest agent, who was only 21 at the time, Hattie Grunwald. And so it was all a bit of I felt Julian was doing me a little bit of a favor. He handed me to a very young agent who also needed a first client. And it was like, let's see what we can do here. And I'll forever be grateful for it because it was just incredible to write your first book. And within 2 years of writing the first word, it was published.
Wow.
It was really fast. Now the advance was not enough really to pay for. It was really bad. Very low 4 figures, maybe the lowest, second lowest, without getting too specific. I finished 3 young adult novels and then I stopped because I wasn't selling any books really. And I found the industry quite confusing and complicated compared to TV. And I thought, well, I want to write an adult novel, that was always going to be where I was going to end up. And so I did. That was the summer job, and that took a couple of years. And when I finished it, I said, right, that's it. In the meantime, I'd gone back to work, working freelance in TV. And I just said, right, that's it. If that doesn't sell, I'm going to move to writing TV because TV is my first love and publishing is far too difficult. But I'd overcome, get back to the beginning, the confidence problem. because I'd had 3 books out in the world and I'd had 1-star reviews, and they didn't hurt me nearly as much as I thought they did. And I had lots of great 5-star reviews as well. And I just was like, oh, actually, this isn't about everyone liking what you do. This is about finding the readers that do like what you do. And you can't please everyone. And that's the bottom line. So, yeah. So that whole process kind of, that from that lunch date with Rachel to, I guess, the signing of that first young adult book, it really, like, I finally was like, oh yeah, if you get in the arena and you just write the book and you just finish it, you're already miles ahead of where anyone else gets to. And then if you manage to get an agent, that's people telling you you're good, even if he was a friend and you DM'd him on Twitter. And then if you manage to get a publishing deal, however small, you're in the game. There's a few people that think you're good enough. And so that was how it started.
So many of us who are unpublished suffer from lack of confidence. We know that's something that we really want to do. And even if we know how to go about doing it, we're still fearful of judgment. We're still fearful of putting ourselves out there. It's such a common thing. And I love hearing how you overcame that and just got started, just did it.
I think incremental goals are the key in doing something like this. So my first goal was just to see if I had the discipline to sit down and write 80,000 words and not throw it in the bin halfway. That was my goal. Can I just get to the end? And then the next goal was, can I get somebody to tell me if it's shit or not? Literally, that was the question. It wasn't how good it is, could I publish it? It was like, can I write? That was the second goal. And then once that second goal was reached, it kind of snowballed from there, because I mean, publishing's hard, and honestly, I've had some terrible downs as well as, I mean, after the sale of the summer job, it was tough for the next 2 books, which we can talk about later maybe. Just piercing that confidence, feeling like, all right, I'm not terrible at this. I mean, it was a big deal, and it was something I'd fought against my whole life in my industry. Yeah, so it was really a big moment for me. And obviously, once you're confident, everything, you look at sports stars, anyone in any industry, once you have confidence, you're able to really fly then, because you can try new things and push boundaries and like be a bit braver to do something crazy. Or yeah, I definitely feel for it. Like, I would love to work with Wright if there was a way to do it that didn't, it's difficult mentoring new writers, but I would really love to work with them on specifically that, because I think I'm not going to ever be able to tell people how to structure a novel, or I didn't even finish high school, I'm not going to be able to tell anyone how to write. I just do everything. Like, I don't understand craft or anything, but what I do understand is confidence and how that relates to your ability to create with abandon.
As someone who absolutely love to travel, and I love food, and I love Italy in particular, Just One Taste was a novel that ticked so many boxes for me. I wondered, for the benefit of those who haven't yet read this gorgeous story, Lizzy, if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
The story is about Olive and Leo. Olive is estranged from her father, who dies suddenly, and gifts her in his will his failing Italian restaurant. Leo is the sous chef at the restaurant, who perhaps lacks a bit of confidence to step up. He's been there a long time, but he's very, very talented. And Olive happens to have made a career out of being a food critic. So the two of them are thrown together when, as a condition of the will, Olive's father asks them to finish his cookbook that he'd been working on for years. And so the two of them are thrust together, hence the cover artwork of them being wrapped together in spaghetti, and sent to Italy to finish the cookbook. It's a forced proximity, enemies to lovers, although I think more like rivals to lovers. a tough food critic who has to work with a sous chef to finish their father's cookbook. And then obviously other things come up through the story, and there's a bit of an emotional sucker punch towards the end, which I'm glad has resonated with some readers.
I think anyone who goes to Italy and samples the incredible local cuisines and witnesses the Italian gusto for food wouldn't be surprised by a novel inspired by these things. And I've certainly heard this novel described as culinary romance. And I love the names of the different subgenres that people come up with. But of course, Lizzy, this
Yeah.
novel is more than just about Italian food. So I wondered if you could talk me through the seeds that first sparked the idea for this story.
Well, I was watching a lot of The Bear, which which may have helped. And then Jeremy Allen White put out his Calvin Klein ad, which also may have contributed somewhat. No, I'm joking, really. For those people that don't know, The Summer Job, my first novel, was set in the world of food, and that was semi-autobiographical about a girl who goes to live in Scotland and work in a hotel, which I did when I was younger, although I didn't pretend to be a sommelier. I didn't know anything about wine. And I love writing about food. I mean, food and cooking are my kind of main interests. I love to cook. I love making bread. I love wine. I love, that I love it. I spending time in hospitality, I really fell for the craft of cooking, and it's a very sensual interest, feeding people, eating, I mean, I really love it. And so I knew I wanted, for my fourth book, I wanted to go back into that world because my second two were kind of more contemporary, set in offices and things. And I wanted to go back into that world. And then I wanted to do a location novel because The Summer Job, one of its big appeals was that it was set in Scotland, which isn't like a location destination in my mind. But I would quickly learn that to Americans, it's a hugely romantic destination. So anyway, I wanted to do another location novel, and Italy is the country that I visited more than anywhere else. It's my favorite place. And so that's kind of how it came together. I was kind of exploring the concept of, because one of the things about my own self-doubt came about because I was surrounded by, growing up, a lot of critics in the music industry and other industries. We talked and thrashed out and hated and reviewed like films and music and TV, and we all worked in those industries. And that definitely contributed to my fear of producing something myself. But what I loved about Olive was I wanted to make her a food critic because I felt that in her particularly, that was her way of putting a wall up between the industry that she loved and so wanted to be a part of, but also hated because she blamed it for the breakdown of her parents' marriage. So being a very cynical, very tough food critic felt like a really interesting job to then have to face potentially doing that herself. So she'd have to override all of those things. But that was a little bit of my own story sort of tucked in there, as it always is.
I think Olive, as a character, she really resonated with me and I empathized with her enormously. As you mentioned at the beginning, she's grieving the death of her father, and yet she resented this decision of his to leave, his eponymous restaurant to her. It felt like a loaded gift to her.
It is, in a way, for various reasons. He wasn't very present in her life, and it's an emotional weight to drop that on someone. But at the same time, she was his daughter, and it makes logical sense. But yeah, it was an emotional weight to dump on someone's shoulders, especially since you get the impression from the beginning that it's been gifted with the hope that she'll take it over.
And as you said earlier, she had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the industry. Now, my parents had a couple of goes running restaurants when I was growing up, and a family restaurant, perhaps more than any other, can be both a blessing and a curse. They can bring families together or they can tear families apart. And for Olive, Nikki's represented everything that went wrong in her life, and she's quite scathing about the tendency for people to romanticize the hospitality industry, isn't she?
Yeah, she is. Family restaurants, wow. First of all, most of the successful ones require the whole family's involvement. Well, you'll know this. You need all of that labor to kind of keep it going and all of that sort of singular passion. Otherwise, you've got horrendous staffing costs and, you can't, there's lots of reasons why, particularly like Greeks, Italians run restaurants in this way. And I noticed when I was in Sicily, if you go into the smaller trattorias and you walk in the back, there'll be somebody bouncing a baby behind the till and, granny cleaning up and it's a really, really a family business. And I think if the business hums and it makes a lot of money, it can be a really great thing for a family. But it's unsocial hours. You have to be able to be willing to bounce your baby on your knee behind the till at 9 p.m. It's an interesting business. My family in Scotland have restaurants, but they tend to be linked to the hotels. But even then, it's like, imagine, it is a really strange business where everyone finishes work very late at night. There's a lot of drinking that goes on. That's not necessarily at my family's restaurants. That's just everywhere I've ever worked. And in London, particularly, there was a lot of drugs as well. A lot of drinking, a lot of drugs, a lot of late nights. And you kind of only hang out with the people you work with because you can't really, so you become a sort of found family within the restaurant. And most people who work in hospitality in places like London are there to get to the place they really want to be. So family restaurants are interesting because that's where they want to be. Their love is for the restaurant, whereas the other staff are there to make enough money while they finish school, or they've just landed in the country and need something quickly, or whatever it is.
Lizzy, I think anyone who reads this book will be in no doubt about your experience, shall we say, with the different regional cuisines that you've written about in this book. It's so sumptuous. It's so beautiful. And you've gone into Sicilian, Tuscan, and Ligurian cuisines. Can you tell me a bit more about your decision to showcase those regions in particular?
I really wanted to go to Sicily. I'd never been. So I went there, obviously, to do a research trip. It was very punishing, hard, tough work. So that's why I chose Sicilian. And I was really interested because when I got there, Sicilian cuisine, for those of you who don't know, is such a mishmash of Greek and North African, Italian, even a little bit of French in there, like Spanish, certainly. It's a real melting pot of cuisine and it has its own totally unique dishes. And I was really surprised at that. And actually, personally, it's not my favorite region for eating. So it took a little bit of getting used to when I got there because I was like, oh, okay, pasta al norma, which is their big famous dish there, is like aubergine and tomato pasta. It's pretty plain. Some of the other ones I tried were really heavy, a lot of pestos and things like that. And a lot of seafood, mind you. It was eclectic and different. Some of the best food I'd eaten, but also some of the weirdest. so, so I chose Sicily for selfish reasons because I wanted to visit there. Tuscany, I've been to Tuscany a few times, and one of my biggest memories is being on top of a hill overlooking Florence when I was 19 and the sun was setting and I was drinking a bottle of wine with a total stranger that I'd met at the backpackers. And I was just so taken by it. And I was like, oh, I took my mum back a few years later and stuff. And so Florence was definitely going to be on it. Just such a romantic memory of that region. And in Liguria, it's really interesting. Basically, when I was in my 20s, I booked a holiday. It was in the sort of early days of cheap airfares, and I booked a holiday to Genoa, which I didn't even know really what it was. And me and some friends went down onto the coast there, Portofino, Cinque Terre, Rapallo, all that Riviera region. And I had a plate of pesto and green bean pasta. And I was like, wow, this is really weird and delicious and interesting. And I ended up going back to that region, I think 5 times over the next decade. So that region was really, I know, and I had to go there as well. Just the places, yeah.
As I mentioned in my introduction, so much of the way that you wrote about the food and the area just makes you want to go there, just makes you want to eat the food or cook the food. Such a sensual, sumptuous experience reading this book. You've just done a marvelous job with that. And you can tell, because one of my questions was, do you love cooking? But I think you can tell by the way that you've written about this food that you really do love your food and you love to cook.
Yeah, I really do. And I love to cook Italian food. I mean, I get better and better at it. It's so funny when you first learn how to cook pasta and you know, do the usual, I don't know, bolognese recipe. And then after sort of 20 years of trying different ragouts and eating different ways to make a bolognese, and suddenly you find you actually have your own recipe now. I love that. And I'm so good at it now. Like I can safely say, if you give me 10 minutes in a sparsely stocked kitchen that has some pasta, I can make you something kick-ass. And I love making bread as well. That's another real love of mine. You know, the problem is that I've got kids, so it has slowed down a lot in the last 10 years because I mean, I still cook when I can, but it's sort of relegated more to the weekend. And we also have to accept that the kids won't necessarily eat it. And it is a dampener.
Okay, so even though Olive's dad, Nicky, wasn't on the page, so to speak, in this novel, I think he still managed to be a larger than life or the larger than life character of Olive's memory. And, we were just talking about food and your love of food, but food for Nicky was not just a vocation, it was an expression of love. And so, I guess it was just hard when reading this not to feel sadness for the years that they lost.
Yeah, I mean, really sad. I actually don't think about that too much because it is kind of the lingering sadness of the novel, but it isn't either of their faults. It's a combination of misunderstandings and not enough information, and Olive wanting to protect her mum, really. I mean, divorce is such a complicated issue, I think, in that regard, because if there isn't anyone at fault per se, or even if there is someone, the fault here is about money, right? And that's a really common issue for what can break a marriage down. Otherwise, there isn't a huge amount of fault per se, although Olive's mum felt, sidelined their whole marriage by her larger than life partner. But I think in those scenarios, most kids retain a very strong relationship with both parents anyway. But I think in Olive's case, for various reasons, her dad didn't feel that he could demand that of her. And that's kind of sad.
Exploring the father daughter relationship was something that you've done really, really well in this novel. Was that something you were conscious of while you were writing it?
No, I don't know. I mean, I'm very close with my dad, but I know it wasn't something that I was particularly going in there to do. I mean, originally Nikki was like a really puffed up celebrity chef, super famous, and Olive was also a super famous food critic, so they had a much more high profile dynamic. But when you're being edited and your editor says it needs to be realistic, people need to be able to relate to everyone. So everything sort of gets slightly cooled. But yeah, no, it wasn't specific to that. Father and daughter relationships are very special. I love watching my partner with my daughters. It brings out a really soft side in men having daughters. They say girls grow up to look for men that they see their father reflected in. So a good male role model is also really great for your girls. So I don't know. I like the father-daughter relationship. It's very important.
And we can't talk about this book, Lizzie, without talking about Leo. He's the hunky chef that Olive inherits along with her father's restaurant. Just joking. She doesn't inherit him, but it kind of feels that way. Leo is everything Olive isn't. And you get the sense that while he could easily find another job as a chef, he's passionate about this restaurant and continuing Nikki's legacy. And that's not something Olive can deal with, or she doesn't deal very well with it, does she?
No, getting Leo right was really tricky because we had to make sure that he didn't look like a sad sack who couldn't go out and get another job, because we kept saying, well, why wouldn't he just leave and go somewhere else? He's so talented. But, I think Nikki was his mentor. Nikki gave him his first break. And then on the practical side, this is a restaurant right in the middle of central London with no rent because he owned the property. So it was also a gift horse in his eyes. He was like, if she doesn't want it, oh, this is crazy, because it could be such a big place, such an amazing place. And I think that's why he sort of digs his heels in and says, don't sell. Can I talk you out of it? Please don't do it. There's so much potential here. And she's like, nah, I just see a horrible place, and where my parents split up. And if I sell it, I can be a Londoner with my own home. That's hard to walk away from. That's what most people do when they inherit something in an industry they're not working in, or a business they don't want to do. They sell it as quickly as they can and get on with the life they really want. But I guess the story is about Olive finding the life she always did want, but walked away from because of what happened with her parents. I think Leo's backstory is pretty beautiful, and I think he's a really good person. I don't like, even in Enemies to Lovers, I don't like writing arrogant men. Although, having said that, my next book does feature one, but he's a racing car driver, so he had to be. Um, Generally, I don't like that I don't like writing that buttoned up or sort of puffed up, arrogant, classic Enemies to Lovers guy. Which incidentally was why I think, Beach Read by Emily Henry still probably is my favorite rom-com of all time. And I just think she handled the intellectual arrogance of Gus so well, because he was so vulnerable the whole time. And he wasn't a big beefcake. She describes him as kind of slender, and I think she's very good at that. I mean, there's a lot of romance novels with the big beefy guy with the muscular arms and things like that, who fall eventually to the feminine charms of their leading lady, which is also a very great trope and people love it. But personally, for me, I prefer softer men.
I think writing romantic relationships is such a skill, and the sexual tension between Olive and Leo in this book had me flipping pages in my haste to find out if they act on their feelings. So I wanted to know, Lizzy, is that something that you're very conscious of while you're writing? And how do you balance the romantic threads of the plot with other aspects of your storytelling?
Well, I find it quite difficult. My editor had a really hard time with me on this book. I'm not a planner, although I'm having to learn to be. And because I didn't train, I didn't do any English degrees or anything like that, or writing degrees or whatever. Everything I've learned has been like on the job, so to speak. And I think with this book, it's definitely the most emotionally complicated that I've written. I really struggled with it. I found it very hard. And the chemistry was obvious to me. It was obvious why Olive didn't like Leo or wanted to stay away from Leo. But on the other hand, it was also a subtle thing, because she was jealous of him in her own way, and she resented him as well a little bit, but also wanted to like him. I think deep down, it was more of a wall. And that's why I say it's not, for me, it's not classic Enemies to Lovers. She disliked him because she was in so much pain about what he represented. But anyway, I think the chemistry was like a sort of, I mean, he's so sensual and so into food, and just such a soft place to fall for Olive, who was emotionally bereft about lots of things throughout the book and having a bit of a whirlwind of a time. And he was just I could just imagine them falling in love in the conditions that they were in. One thing I will say is the chemistry and the romance thing is really interesting to me, because so many romance books at the moment have a lot of spice and a lot of, like, the book, it feels like the plots are written around the chemistry. The chemistry is the driving force there. And I know that that's necessary for a romance book, but for me, it never is. That's always slightly below the story I'm trying to tell. And I struggle a little bit sometimes, because people want more spice, more like that. That's what people read romance for. So finding that balance, back to your original question, is really hard into writing spice very naturally. For me, it's more about the slow burn, like learning to trust each other. That stuff for me is the things I like. But most romance readers want these, especially these days, want a hell of a lot of spice. Even though, I mean, Just One Taste has some of it, but it's, not several pages of it, like there is in many these days.
To satisfy the die-hard romantics who may be listening to this podcast, I wondered if you could kind of give us an indication of the heat level of this book.
I don't really know. Do you think it's a 1 or a 2? It's not closed door.
No, it's definitely not closed door. It's open door. I would say maybe it's like, 1.5 to 2 chilies.
Yeah, I would say so. There's one scene that's particularly, but it's not like ongoing, I guess.
You did mention that, Rach is your cousin, and most Australian listeners would know about Rachel Johns and her work. So, writing romantic comedy must run in the family.
Yeah, it's great actually. Of the two of us, Rachel is the die-hard romance writer. She is so good at it, and she is really into it, and she loves it completely. That isn't to say she doesn't love reading other things, but she is a romance writer through and through. I think my driving force with writing tends to be more about the women's story of something that they're trying to, like I said before, the romance comes slightly under the plot for me, whereas I think Rachel is a full out and out romance writer, and she's just so good at it. And actually, it's so funny because I read The Other Bridget and I put it down. I was just like, oh my God, the craft. She's just so good at it, you know? You can tell she's written 20 books and has lived and breathed writing and reading her whole life. And I don't think I know I'm nowhere near that. I think eventually I'm gonna, well, I've already finished drafting a book in a totally different genre. So I think while I'll keep going with romance, I'll definitely branch out into other genres as well, if they'll have me. I wish I had like a tenth of her talent. She's just amazing. But the great thing about Rachel is if I get stuck, I can phone her up and she'll be like, oh, driving someone to football practice or whatever. And she'll be like, all right, send it to me. I'll let you know what I think. And she does that occasionally with me, which I can't believe. And so we do help each other a lot. And Just One Taste is her favorite book of mine.
Lizzy, for the listeners out there who've yet to read this novel, I wondered if you could tell me what is the most important takeaway from the novel, do you think?
It's strange because obviously the romance is really gorgeous and the writing and the food is really gorgeous. But I think the thing that I take away from it is the unexpressed love, the sadness of missing out on unexpressed love. So I guess I would say that I would like people to maybe remind their mum or their dad how special they are now and then, or vice versa, and remember that they're people and humans who make decisions that are not always perfect or good or right, but that generally, if you've got good parents, they're doing their best.
You mentioned that you were writing another book. So can you tell us anything more about that?
I've finished drafting one book. I'm excited about that. That is set in a vineyard in the South Pacific, just north of New Zealand, north of Auckland. It's the story of two best friends with a deep, long history. And then one of the best friends does something major to the other one. And it's the fallout from that. It's a drama. Its comp title is The Paper Palace, which I'm thrilled about because that's like one of my favorite ever books. That book is going to go out on submission in a couple of months. Ugh. And obviously, I co-wrote that with another author, so it will not come out as a Lizzy Dent novel, but I'll keep everyone posted as that if it comes out. And then I'm writing another rom-com, which is set in the world of Formula One, and it was requested by my US publisher. She just said, I want to do something in Formula One, and I'd been working at Red Bull, and so it made sense to go ahead and do that. Oh, it's probably the funnest book I've ever written. It's really fun. It's like about a struggling bottom of the league Formula One team who ends up getting a female team principal as a publicity stunt. And it's really fun.
My family are huge Red Bull fans. We love Formula One. My husband in particular loves Formula One.
Well, I'm a big Formula One fan as well. And my publisher, Anna at HarperCollins, is a massive Formula One fan. So she's read the first 3 chapters. So fingers crossed they buy it and it comes out in Australia next year.
Lizzy, I always ask authors if they can share a tip or two or three, even for the many writers who listen into this podcast. And I know that you provided a bit of inspiration earlier in our chat, but what would your top pieces of advice be?
Well, the first one is to just finish it. Do not get hung up on whether it's good or bad or anything. There's no point. You actually can't decipher that anyway. So just finish it. I mean, a lot of writers say that, just keep going, keep going. It's a difficult advice if you're being rejected or you're finding that it's not working. And so I revert to Rachel's advice on that. If you can't stop, then you're a writer. But if you can stop because it's too tough and you're struggling and things, then maybe you should, because it's a bloody hard industry and it's filled with disappointments, and I've had plenty of my own. Rachel told me that advice and I was like, whoa, that's harsh, but I do get it now after 7 books. You have to really want this to do it because it's tough and the rewards are slim, and not many people reach her level of security in the industry. But do not stop, keep going, and get that book finished and get it in front of other people.
Lizzy, I can't tell you what a joy it was to read this novel. Just one taste, a must read for rom-com fans and readers of culinary romance, if you will. I wish you every success with this book, Lizzy, and thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled that I got to be on my first Aussie podcast.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.